Hey, welcome back. Before you drift off tonight, while you're still awake enough to remember, tap that follow button. Just a gentle press. It helps keep this quiet corner of the world alive, this space we've carved out together, away from the noise and the rush of the day. And if you're feeling generous with your drowsy energy, a like would mean the world. It tells the algorithm that there are still people out there who want to slow down, who want to sink into mystery instead of being startled by it. If you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a small room with rain against the window? A city apartment with distant traffic humming below? Somewhere by the coast maybe, where you can almost hear what we're about to explore? I love knowing where these stories travel, how they find you in your particular corner of the world, in your particular kind of darkness. This channel exists for nights like this, when you need something that won't jolt you awake, when you want a story that feels like memory, like folklore, like a documentary filmed in fog and candlelight. No jump scares, no manufactured tension, just questions, atmosphere, the slow pull of something ancient and patient, waiting to be understood. So let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw if it's tight, let your tongue rest easy in your mouth, feel the weight of your body against whatever holds you. Bed, couch, floor, wherever you've landed tonight, you're exactly where you need to be. And tonight, we're stepping into something that's been waiting for a long time. Tonight, we're walking along a shoreline where the water keeps a different kind of time. Tonight, we're following footprints that appear and vanish according to rules we're only beginning to understand. Tonight, we're stepping into Footprints on the Tidal Clock. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Keeper's Landing. The village of Barrow's Hem sits at the eastern edge of a peninsula that has no proper name on modern maps, though the old maritime charts call it St. Osric's Finger, after a hermit who supposedly lived in a cave there in the 7th century. The village itself is small, maybe 40 permanent residents in the winter, twice that in summer, when the holiday cottages fill with families from Birmingham and Manchester seeking quieter shores. But we're not here for the village, not really. We're here for the beach that stretches north, from the last stone cottage, a beach that reveals itself only twice a day, and even then, only partially. The locals call it Lowmere Strand, though strand suggests something fixed and reliable, and Lowmere is neither of those things. It shifts, it changes, it operates according to tidal patterns that don't quite match the printed tables you can pick up at the harbour master's office, 3 villages over. The sand there is fine and pale, almost silver in certain light. It holds footprints beautifully. Too beautifully, some say. Footprints that should have been erased by the incoming water remain. Footprints that shouldn't exist at all appear. This is where our story begins, though the mystery itself is older than anyone can properly trace. Picture it now. Dawn breaking over the North Sea, that particular quality of light that's neither grey nor gold, but something in between, something the colour of old pearls. The tide has pulled back during the night, dragging itself out across the shallow shelf of the bay, leaving behind the usual debris, kelp ribbons, crab shells, fragments of driftwood worn smooth as bone. The air smells of salt and cold stone, of that ancient mineral scent that comes from the meeting of water and rock over thousands of years. And there, in a perfectly preserved line, leading from the base of the cliff path down to the water's edge, are footprints. Bare feet, human-sized, walking with purpose, not wandering. The stride length suggests someone tall, or at least someone moving with intention, not strolling but walking steadily towards some specific destination. The prints are clean-edged, deeply impressed, as though whoever made them was carrying weight or pressing down with unusual force. The first strange thing, is that they only go in one direction, down to the water, not back. The second strange thing is that no one walked this beach last night. The tide was in until 3 hours ago, and the narrow window between the water's retreat and dawn's arrival was dark, moonless, with a fog that rolled in thick enough that you couldn't see 5 feet in front of your face. No one in Barrow's Hem goes walking Lomere Strand in conditions like that. The path down is steep and treacherous, even in daylight, a narrow cut through sedimentary rock that crumbles if you lean too heavily against it. And yet, these footprints. Margaret Hollis finds them first. She's the unofficial keeper of the Strand now, though that's not a title anyone gave her formally. It's more that she's the one who pays attention, who walks the beach every morning when the tide allows, who keeps a journal, 12 volumes now, spanning 36 years, documenting what she finds. She's 73, with hands weathered from a lifetime of coastal living, and eyes that have learned to see patterns where others see randomness. She wears the same wax jacket every morning, the same green Wellington boots, carries the same canvas bag for collecting samples. Unusual stones, fragments of glass worn smooth by the sea, occasionally things stranger than that. This morning she stops at the top of the cliff path and simply looks. The footprints stretch out before her, like a statement, like a sentence written in a language she's been trying to learn for decades. The low sun casts them in sharp relief, tiny shadows, pooling in each impression, making them look almost sculptural against the silver sand. Margaret descends carefully, one hand on the rough stone wall of the path, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air, her boots crunch on loose pebbles. A seabird cries somewhere overhead, that lonely sound that seems to belong specifically to empty beaches at dawn. When she reaches the sand, she doesn't immediately approach the prints. This is her ritual, her method. She stands at the transition point where pebbles give way to sand, and she observes, takes in the whole scene, the way the light falls, the pattern of the tide's retreat visible in the rippled texture of wet sand further down, the scattered pools in the natural depressions of the beach, each one a small mirror reflecting the pale sky. Only then does she walk alongside the line of prints, careful not to disturb them, and she counts 47 prints in total, a stride length of approximately 85 centimetres, depth suggesting a weight of perhaps 11 stone, maybe 12. And the detail, this is what makes her pull out her phone, what makes her hands tremble slightly as she crouches down to photograph the clearest impression. The detail is extraordinary. She can see the individual patterns of the skin, the whorls and lines that make each foot unique. She can see where the weight distributed unevenly, slightly more pressure on the outside edge, suggesting someone who walks often, who has developed the slight supination common to people who travel long distances on foot. These aren't just marks in sand, these are prints, as though the person who made them walked here only moments ago, as though they might still be visible if she looked up quickly enough, as though they're just beyond the line where morning fog still clings to the surface of the retreating sea. Margaret photographs each one, takes measurements, sketches the overall pattern in her waterproof notebook, and as she works she's thinking about the others, the other mornings like this, the other prints that have appeared over the years, always following the same path, always leading to the water, never returning. The thing is, this isn't the first time, not even close. This is simply the latest iteration of a pattern that goes back further than Margaret's journals, further than her mother's stories, further than the parish records kept in the village church's dry stone vestry. This is part of something older, something tidal. Chapter 2. The Archive beneath the church. The church of St Osric sits on the highest point of Barrow's Hem, a stubby stone building that has stood in one form or another since the 11th century, though portions have been rebuilt, repaired and revised through the centuries, like a ship that's had every plank replaced, but somehow remains the same vessel. The tower is Norman, thick-walled and solid, with narrow windows that let in only thin blades of light. The nave was expanded in the 14th century. The roof was entirely replaced after a storm in 1892. But the oldest part the part that matters for our story, is underneath. The crypt. Most churches this old have them. Chambers beneath the main structure, used originally for burial, later for storage, occasionally for hiding things that needed to be kept out of common knowledge. St. Osric's crypt is accessed through a low door in the vestry, a door that most visitors to the church never notice, positioned as it is behind a cabinet that holds hymnals and the paraphernalia of modern worship. Margaret has keys. She's had them for years, granted by Reverend Pettigrew, who serves 3 parishes along this stretch of coast and trusts Margaret with the maintenance of the building's historical elements. He's not particularly interested in the archive himself. His calling is more pastoral than antiquarian, but he recognises that some people are drawn to the layers, the accumulated history, the patient work of preservation. The stone steps down are worn smooth in their centres, centuries of feet creating gentle depressions. Margaret's hand finds the rope guide that serves as a banister, and she descends into the cooler, stiller air below. There's a particular smell down here, old paper and stone dust, the mineral scent of earth, something faintly like candle wax, though no candles have burned here in decades. Not since electric lighting was grudgingly installed in 1964. The crypt itself is a single vaulted chamber, perhaps 8 metres long and 5 wide, with alcoves along the walls that once held bodies but now hold wooden crates and metal filing cabinets, and shelves lined with volumes in various states of decay. This is where the parish records live, the ones too old or too fragile for regular handling. Baptisms and deaths, marriages and transfers of property, the ordinary paperwork of centuries of village life. But there's another collection here too, less organised, more idiosyncratic, a gathering of documents that previous vicars and local historians compiled over the years, all relating to what they sometimes called the Lowmere phenomenon, and sometimes called the walking, and sometimes, in the oldest texts, called the tide pilgrims. Margaret sets her bag down on the wooden table that occupies the centre of the chamber and pulls the chain on the overhead bulb. Yellow light floods the space, making the shadows darker by contrast. She's done this enough times that she knows exactly which shelf, which box, which folder. She pulls down a leather-bound ledger, the spine cracked and repaired multiple times with different colours of binding tape, and she opens it carefully on the table. The earliest entry is dated June 7th, 1741. The handwriting is difficult, the spelling irregular even by the standards of the time, but Margaret has transcribed portions of this and she knows what it says. The entry is by a man named Thomas Wicklow, who served as both parish clerk and schoolmaster, and who apparently took an interest in the strange occurrences at Lowmere Strand. Upon this morning at the lowest tide, footprints discovered in the sand, leading from the cliff path to the water's edge. No person of the village admits to walking there in the night, and the tide was full until hours past midnight. The prints are of bare feet, well formed, and of a size suggesting a man grown. They number 53 paces and show no return. This is the 4th such occurrence since last Michaelmas. 4 times in 9 months, and this is just when someone started formally recording them. Margaret turns pages, careful with the brittle paper. The next entry is 6 weeks later, then nothing for 2 years, then 3 entries in a single month. The pattern is irregular, which has frustrated everyone who's tried to analyse it. Not tied to lunar phases, not tied to solstices or equinoxes, not tied to any obvious celestial or seasonal pattern, but definitely tied to the tides. Always appearing only when the tide has pulled back far enough to expose the furthest reaches of Lowmere Strand. Always disappearing either by the tide's return or occasionally by simply fading, as though the sand gradually forgot they were there. She finds what she's looking for in an entry from 1868, written by Reverend Blackwood, who apparently combined religious faith with a passionate amateur interest in natural philosophy. His entry is longer, more detailed, more analytical. I have measured today's footprints with considerable care, and can state with confidence that they match in size and stride those documented by my predecessor, Revium Morehouse, in 1842, and those described, though less precisely measured, in the earlier records extending back to the mid-18th century. This consistency is remarkable and suggests either a single individual of impossible longevity or multiple individuals of notably similar physical characteristics, or, and I propose this with appropriate scientific caution, something else entirely. Something that perhaps is not best understood through the usual categories of natural observation. Something else entirely. Margaret reads on. Blackwood conducted experiments. He tried staying awake through the night, watching the beach from the cliff top, during the hours when tides would allow the prints to appear. He saw nothing, heard nothing, but in the morning, there they were. He tried raking the sand smooth before nightfall and placing markers, small cairns of pebbles, at intervals along the beach. In the morning, the markers were undisturbed, but the footprints wound between them, as though whoever made them had stepped carefully around these obstacles. He tried, in an entry that Margaret finds both touching and slightly absurd, leaving a lantern burning at the top of the path, thinking perhaps to attract or guide whatever presence made the prints. The lantern burned through the night. The footprints appeared anyway, following their usual course from path to water, seemingly indifferent to his welcome. In his final entry on the subject, written 3 weeks before his death from pneumonia in 1870, Blackwood wrote, "I have come to believe that we are witnessing not a visitation from elsewhere, but a kind of echo, a repetition of something that occurred long ago and with such force, such intention, that it has somehow impressed itself upon the landscape itself. The beach remembers, the sand remembers, and under the right conditions I confess I do not fully understand, it shows us what it remembers. The beach remembers." Margaret sits back, the old chair creaking beneath her. She's read this passage dozens of times, but it still raises the hair on her arms. Because if Blackwood was right, if this is memory rather than current action, then the question becomes, what happened? What was the original event that was so significant, so charged with meaning or emotion, or simple human will, that it left a permanent mark on this particular stretch of shoreline? And why does it repeat? She pulls out her phone and looks at the photos she took this morning. The clear, detailed prints, the purposeful stride, the journey to the water with no return. Outside, through the narrow slit of window, high in the crypt wall, she can hear the distant sound of the sea. The tide will be turning soon, beginning its slow march back up the beach. By afternoon, Lomere Strand will be underwater again, the footprints erased or submerged, hidden until the next low tide reveals the sand again. If the pattern holds, and it almost always does, there will be no prints tomorrow. Perhaps not for days, perhaps not for weeks, but they'll return. They always do. Margaret closes the ledger gently and returns it to its shelf. She has work to do, measurements to record, photographs to catalogue, patterns to analyse. She's been doing this for 36 years, and she still doesn't have answers. But she has more questions now, better questions, and sometimes that's the same as progress. Sometimes, in the slow work of understanding mysteries, patience is the only method that works. Chapter 3. The Tidal Mechanism. Before we go further into the human stories, the searches and the wonderings, we should understand the place itself. Because Lomere Strand is unusual not just for its footprints, but for its tides. The North Sea is tidal, of course. All seas are, pulled by the moon's gravity and the sun's by the complex dance of celestial mechanics that makes the water rise and fall twice daily in most places. But the tides along this particular stretch of coast don't quite behave the way the charts predict. There's a PhD thesis about it, actually, written in 1989 by a marine geologist named David Chen, working out of Durham University. Margaret has a copy of it, photocopied and spiral-bound, in her cottage. It's titled Anomalous Tidal Patterns in the Barrow's Hem. Coastal Region, a study of bathymetric influence on local hydrodynamics, which is the kind of title that wins academic approval but puts everyone else to sleep. The actual content, though, is fascinating if you have the patience for it. Chen spent 2 years taking measurements, installing temporary monitoring equipment, mapping the underwater topography of the bay with sonar equipment borrowed from the university's oceanography department. What he found was that the sea floor in this area is unusually complex, a combination of natural rock formations and what appears to be partially collapsed man-made structures, possibly from the medieval period or earlier, creating a kind of underwater maze that disrupts the normal flow of tidal water. The result is that the tides here don't simply rise and fall predictably. They pulse, they hesitate, they sometimes seem to move in multiple directions at once, creating local currents that can be dangerous if you're not aware of them. And this is the detail that made Chen's thesis notable beyond its academic audience. There are specific days when the tide recedes much further than normal, exposing portions of the beach that are usually permanently submerged. These days don't correspond to spring tides or any regular astronomical phenomenon. They happen irregularly, perhaps 6 or 8 times a year, and they're what the locals have learned to call deep ebb days. The footprints only appear on deep ebb days, always, without exception. Now, Chen's thesis doesn't mention the footprints. That wasn't his field, and it's likely no one told him about them. His focus was purely on the hydraulic mechanics, the movement of water, the physical explanation for why the tides behave strangely here. But Margaret, reading his thesis years after it was published, saw immediately that he'd provided half of an answer to a question he didn't know anyone was asking. The tides here operate on a different schedule, a different rhythm. There's a kind of clock at work, but it's not the simple lunar clock that governs most coastal regions. It's something more complex, influenced by underwater topography and possibly by other factors that Chen's equipment couldn't measure. Margaret has her own theory, though it's one she keeps mostly to herself, knowing how it sounds. She thinks the underwater structures, whatever they are, whatever remains of them, are deliberate, not accidental, not just the collapsed remnants of some forgotten fishing weir or harbour installation. She thinks they were built specifically to create this tidal pattern, this irregular but persistent deep ebb. She thinks someone centuries ago engineered this beach to have memory. It sounds absurd saying it plainly like that, but consider, human beings have been manipulating water for thousands of years. Aqueducts and canals, mills and dams, intricate systems of channels and reservoirs. Is it really so impossible that someone, somewhere, figured out how to build something that would create a specific tidal pattern? A pattern that would regularly reveal a specific stretch of beach, preserving whatever marks were left there during those revealing moments. She's gone diving once years ago with a friend who had the equipment and the certification. They went out on a calm day at high tide and descended carefully down to where the underwater structures begin. Visibility was poor. The North Sea isn't known for its clarity, but she could see enough. Stones arranged in patterns that didn't look natural. Right angles where there shouldn't be right angles. Something that looked almost like a curved wall, overgrown with kelp and barnacles, but still holding its shape after what must be centuries of exposure to current and storm. Her friend, who had no particular interest in mysteries, who'd agreed to the dive simply as a favour, said it looked like an old fish trap. One of the big ones that monks used to build in the medieval period, elaborate stone structures that would catch fish on the high tide and hold them as the water receded. Maybe that's all it is, but fish traps don't usually create anomalous tidal patterns. Fish traps don't usually last for centuries, and fish traps don't usually align so perfectly with the appearance of unexplained footprints. Margaret surfaces from these thoughts. She's been standing at her cottage window, looking out toward where the sea is visible as a grey line in the distance, and realises the afternoon has passed. The light is fading toward that long northern twilight, the sky turning the colour of moths and old silver. She makes tea, Earl Grey, strong and hot, with a splash of milk. She carries it to the small desk where her current journal lies open, and she begins to write. November 17th, 47 prints, deep ebb at 0347, prints discovered at 06.15, pattern consistent with previous observations. Tread analysis suggests same individual or repeated template. No disturbances, no irregularities. The beach remembers clearly today. She pauses, pen hovering over the page, then adds, question, if someone built the tidal mechanism deliberately, what were they trying to preserve? What was important enough to engineer the sea itself? Outside, the first stars appear in the darkening sky, and far below, the tide begins its ancient return, water creeping back across the sand, covering the day's secrets, preparing for the next revealing. Chapter 4. The Keeper's Lineage. Margaret was not the first in her family to watch Lomere Strand. This is important. This is part of how the mystery has been preserved, passed down not through official channels, but through the quiet continuity of attention, one generation teaching the next where to look and when. Her mother, Eleanor Hollis, kept the journals before her, 31 years of observations from 1946 until her death in 1977. Before that, Eleanor's father, Margaret's grandfather, Thomas Weatherby, though his records were less systematic, more like a sailor's log with occasional entries about the walking footprints mixed in among notes about weather and fishing conditions and the small transactions of village life. And before Thomas, there are gaps. The record becomes fragmented. But there are names that appear in the church archives, in the margins of parish registers, in letters preserved by families who didn't quite know why they were keeping them. Names of people who paid attention, who walked the beach, who noticed patterns. The Wicklows, the Harpers, the woman called Black Joan, though whether Black was her surname or a descriptor isn't clear from the surviving references. A man named Septimus Cole in the 1820s, who was apparently regarded as slightly mad but harmless, who spent every deep ebb day on the beach, sketching and measuring, and according to one letter, conversing with the sand as though it might answer him. These were the keepers, though no one called them that officially. They were the ones who remembered to look, who taught their children or their neighbours or whoever would listen that this beach was worth watching, that the patterns mattered, that the mystery deserved patience. Margaret learned from her mother, but not all at once, not through a single momentous conversation or a formal passing of responsibility. It was more gradual than that, more organic. It started when she was 7 or 8, when Eleanor would sometimes take her down to the beach on early mornings and teach her to really look at things, not just glance and move on, but actually see. "Look at the sand," Eleanor would say, crouching down, her finger tracing the tiny ripples left by the tide's retreat. "See how it makes patterns? Each one is unique, but they're all following the same rules. Water and gravity and time. If you learn to read these patterns, you can tell how fast the tide went out, which direction the wind was blowing, whether there was rain in the night." Young Margaret would crouch beside her mother, mimicking her posture, trying to see what Eleanor saw. And gradually, over months and years, she began to. Her eyes learned to parse the information in the landscape, to notice the subtle differences in how wet sand reflected light compared to dry, to recognise the particular texture that meant the tide had been out for 2 hours versus 4. The first time she saw the footprints, she was 12. Eleanor woke her before dawn, a school day, which made it feel even more significant, and they walked down to the beach together, in the dark, carrying a torch that Eleanor kept pointed down, saying they needed to preserve their night vision for the approach. When they reached the sand, Eleanor turned off the torch and they waited. Slowly, as the sky lightened, the beach emerged from darkness, and there, running in a line from the cliff path to the water, were the prints, Margaret. remembers the feeling exactly. Not fear, which is what you might expect. Or, yes, confusion certainly. But more than anything, a sense of privilege, that she was being shown something rare and strange and important, that she was being trusted with it. "Don't touch them," Eleanor said softly. "We document, but we don't disturb." They spent the morning there, Eleanor showing Margaret how to measure stride length, how to photograph from different angles to capture depth and detail, how to sketch the overall pattern in case the camera failed. And all the while, Eleanor talked quietly about the history, about what the church records said, about her father's observations, about the questions that no one had answered yet. "Why do you keep watching?" Margaret asked at one point, "if no one knows what it means?" Eleanor was silent for a long moment, looking out at the grey sea, at the place where the footprints ended in shallow water. "Because someone should," she finally said, "because the world is full of mysteries that get forgotten because everyone's too busy to pay attention. And maybe we'll never know what this is. Maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is just bearing witness, saying we saw it, we noticed, we cared enough to watch." That answer satisfied 12-year-old Margaret, though she didn't fully understand it then. She understands it better now, after decades of her own watching. There's something deeply human about this work, this patient attention to mystery. It's the opposite of the modern instinct to explain everything immediately, to Google for answers, to move on if the explanation isn't instantly available. This is about sitting with the question, living alongside it, letting it become part of the rhythm of your life, like the tides themselves. Margaret inherited the journals when her mother died, a stroke sudden and complete on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Eleanor was 68, not young but not old enough, never old enough. Margaret was 43 then, already living back in Barrow's Hem after years away in Leeds where she'd worked in library archives, a job that perhaps she'd chosen because of this early training in careful documentation and patient observation. She came home for the funeral and never left. The journals were waiting for her, stacked in Eleanor's workroom, the spare bedroom that had gradually transformed into a space dedicated entirely to the Lomere mystery. Notebooks and loose papers, photographs in careful albums, maps with marks and annotations, tide charts going back decades, and a letter, sealed envelope with Margaret's name in Eleanor's precise handwriting. She didn't open it immediately. She carried it around for 3 days, this last communication from her mother, knowing that once she read it, there would be nothing else new to hear from Eleanor ever again. But finally, on a grey afternoon very much like this one, she sat at Eleanor's desk and carefully opened the envelope. The letter was short. That was Eleanor's way, never using 3 words where one would do. "Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're wondering what to do with all of this. Maybe you'll want to stop. Maybe you'll want to hand the journals to the university or the local historical society and let someone else carry it forward. That's fine. You don't owe anything to my obsession. But if you do continue, and I think you might because you've always had the patience for this, remember, it's not about solving it. It's about watching. Keep your eyes open. Keep the records accurate. And if you ever figure out what it means, what it's for, write to me somehow. I'd love to know. Mum." Margaret read it 3 times. Then she put it back in the envelope and placed it in the front of the first journal, the one from 1946, the one where Eleanor's entries begin with the awkward handwriting of a young woman still learning how to observe and record, and then she walked down to Lomere Strand and began her own watch. That was 36 years ago. Chapter 5. The Walker Who Stayed. There's one story in the archives that Margaret returns to often, that troubles and intrigues her in equal measure. It's from 1894, recorded by the parish priest at the time, Father Michael Ashworth, and it's different from all the other entries because this time, someone saw the walker. Not the footprints, the actual person making them. Her name was Iris Cole, and she was 26 years old, a schoolteacher's daughter from York, who'd come to Barrow's Hem for a summer holiday. The records describe her as of sound mind and good character, which is the kind of thing people say when they're establishing that someone should be believed despite the strangeness of what they're reporting. Iris was staying at the village inn, the same building that still stands, though it's been converted to a private home now, and apparently she had trouble sleeping. The sea air kept her awake, she told people, or perhaps it was the unusual quiet after the noise of York. Whatever the reason, she would go for walks at night, unchaperoned, which raised a few eyebrows, but was tolerated because she was a paying guest and the innkeeper's wife rather liked her. On the night of August 12th, 1894, Iris walked down to Lowmere Strand. There was a full moon, unusual for a deep ebb day, but not impossible, and the beach was clearly visible in the silver blue light. She walked along the cliff top first, according to her later account, just enjoying the view, the endless shimmer of moonlight on water. And then she saw someone on the beach, a figure walking from the cliff path toward the sea. At first she thought it was another insomniac villager, but something about the way the person moved made her pause. They walked with absolute purpose, absolute straightness, as though following an invisible line. And they were barefoot, she could tell, even from her all distance, and wearing what looked like a long nightgown or shift, white fabric that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Iris called out, a simple hello to let the person know they weren't alone, to perhaps invite companionship on this strange late walk. The figure didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her in any way. Concerned now, was this person sleepwalking? Were they in danger? Iris hurried down the cliff path, scrambling a bit in her rush, reaching the sand, breathing hard. The figure was still walking, still moving steadily toward the water, and now that Iris was closer, she could see that the person was a woman, youngish, with long dark hair loose down her back. The white garment was indeed a nightgown, simple and old-fashioned even by 1894 standards, the kind of thing you might see in paintings of medieval maidens. "Are you all right?" Iris called, jogging to catch up. "Miss, are you all right?" No response. The woman kept walking. Iris reached out, meaning to touch the woman's shoulder, to stop her, Her hand passed through empty air. Not through the woman. The woman was there, visibly there, solid-looking in the moonlight. But Iris's hand met no resistance, felt nothing, as though the space where the woman appeared to be was actually vacant. In her written account, preserved in Father Ashworth's records, Iris describes standing there, with her arm outstretched, watching the woman walk on, watching her reach the water's edge, watching her keep walking as the shallow waves lapped around her ankles, her shins, her knees, watching her walk into the sea until the water closed over her head and she was gone. Iris ran into the water after her, splashed through the shallows, calling out, though she wasn't sure what name to call, dove under the surface, feeling with her hands, finding nothing but sand and water. The woman had simply vanished. When Iris returned to the beach, shivering and sobbing, she noticed the footprints for the first time. A clear trail from the cliff path to the water, each print distinct in the wet sand. Footprints that led to the spot where the woman had disappeared. Footprints that Iris's own feet had not disturbed or overlapped, even though she'd been running right beside the woman. Father Ashworth interviewed Iris multiple times over the following week. He was thorough, sceptical, but not dismissive, trying to determine if she'd been drinking or unwell or suffering some kind of hallucination. But Iris remained consistent in her account. She'd seen what she'd seen. She couldn't explain it. She didn't want to explain it. She simply wanted to record it before she left the village and tried to forget it entirely. The most haunting part of the account, to Margaret's mind, is the description of the woman's face, because Iris did see it briefly when she was close enough to have touched her. She looked neither happy nor sad, Iris wrote, neither frightened nor calm. She looked determined, as though she had made a decision long ago and was simply following through on it, as though she knew exactly what she was doing and why, even if no one else did. Her eyes were open. She was awake, but she didn't see me. She saw something else, something beyond. Father Ashworth adds his own note at the end of Iris's account. I have verified that no young woman drowned in the bay that night, nor has anyone been reported missing. Miss Cole's character is impeccable, and I have no reason to doubt her sincerity. I cannot offer an explanation, but I can confirm that footprints were indeed found on Lowmere Strand the following morning, in the precise location Miss Cole described. They matched in size and stride to the footprints documented in previous years. I have sketched them for the record. The sketch is still there, preserved in the leather-bound ledger. Careful pencil work showing the size and shape of the prints, the spacing, the direction. The same prints that appeared this morning. The same prints that have been appearing for centuries. The woman walking into the sea with purpose and determination. Walking towards something, or away from something, or simply completing a journey that began so long ago that its origin has been lost to time. Margaret has read Iris Cole's account so many times she could recite it from memory, and every time she wonders the same things. Was Iris truly seeing the original event, the moment that somehow burned itself into the beach's memory? And if so, who was the woman? What drove her into the water that night, that first night, whenever it was, with such absolute resolve? There are no records of drownings that match. Father Ashworth checked, and Margaret has checked again with more modern research tools, accessing digitised newspaper archives and coroner's records from the surrounding areas. No young women reported missing or drowned in the late medieval period or early modern period around Barrow's Hem, which means either the death wasn't recorded, always possible, in earlier centuries when record-keeping was spotty at best, or the woman didn't die. That second possibility is the one that keeps Margaret awake some nights. What if the woman walked into the sea and kept going? What if she reached whatever destination she was aiming for? What if this wasn't tragedy but triumph, not drowning but arrival? It sounds absurd, mystical, the kind of thinking that makes you question your own rationality. But Margaret has spent enough years with this mystery to know that the rational explanations don't quite fit. Memory in sand, yes, perhaps. Echo of past events, possibly. But why so precise? Why so consistent? Why does it continue, year after year, century after century, with such determination? The light outside has faded now to that deep blue that comes just before full darkness. Margaret realises she's been standing at her window for longer than she intended, tea gone cold in her cup, her mind wandering through the years and the questions. She needs to eat something. She needs to enter today's observations into her database. Yes, she maintains both the handwritten journals and a digital archive now, backing it up religiously to 3 different locations because she's seen too many years of careful work destroyed by a single flood or fire in other archives. But first, she allows herself one more moment with the thought that has been growing in her mind all day. What if Iris Cole wasn't the only one who saw the walker? What if others have seen her too over the centuries but didn't report it, or reported it and weren't believed, or wrote it down in diaries that have since been lost or destroyed? What if the walker is still walking, still making that journey, and the footprints are just the only trace of her that the ordinary world can perceive? Chapter 6. The Medieval Map. 3 years ago, Margaret made a discovery that shifted her understanding of the mystery, though she's still working out exactly how it fits into the larger pattern. She was in Durham, visiting the Cathedral Library, one of her regular pilgrimages as she thinks of them, journeys to the various archives and collections within 100 miles of Barrow's Hem that might contain relevant historical documents. The Cathedral Library is remarkable, with manuscripts dating back to the 7th century, collections that survived the dissolution of the monasteries and various other historical upheavals through a combination of luck and the dedication of individual librarians who understood what they were protecting. Margaret had put in a request to view several medieval maps of the Northumberland and Durham coastline, thinking she might find early references to Barrow's Hem or the peninsula, perhaps some indication of what the area was used for in earlier centuries. What she found was something more specific than she'd hoped for. The map was from approximately 1325, rendered on vellum in the characteristic style of medieval cartography, not accurate by modern standards, but rich in detail about what the mapmaker considered important. Most medieval maps aren't really meant for navigation. They're meant to communicate meaning, to show relationships, to indicate what matters spiritually and economically and socially. This particular map showed the northeastern coast, with various monasteries and churches marked, fishing villages indicated by small clusters of buildings, and here and there notations in medieval Latin. And there, at the eastern edge of a peninsula that could only be St. Osric's finger, was a symbol Margaret didn't recognise at first. A small circle with what looked like footprints radiating from it, and next to it a notation, Horologium Mariarum, the clock of the tides. Her hands trembled as she photographed the map with her phone, careful not to use flash, careful to get the detail as clear as possible. Then she requested permission to view any accompanying documents, any explanatory texts that might have been created with the map. The librarian, a patient woman in her 60s with silver hair and the particular kind of quiet competence that seems to be required for the profession, disappeared into the deeper stacks and returned 20 minutes later with a slim volume bound in dark leather, the pages brittle but still intact. It was a kind of gazetteer, an index to the map, written by the same hand. Most of the entries were brief: the name of a monastery and its founding date, the name of a village and what goods it was known to produce. But the entry for Horologium Mariarum was longer, more detailed, and stranger than anything else in the volume. Margaret's Latin is functional rather than fluent. She's taught herself over the years, working through primers and dictionaries, because so many of the old church records are in Latin, but this passage challenged her. She photographed it too, and spent the train ride home with a notebook, working through the translation, word by word. The final version, which she knows is imperfect but captures the essential meaning, reads, "At the place called the Clock of the Tides there is a beach which remembers. It was made to remember by the abbot Sinewulf and his brothers in the time of King Athelstan, as an act of mercy and also of warning. Here is kept the memory of the Sister Eadgyth, who walked into the sea at the moon's dark and reached the place she sought. Let any who see her walking know that determination is stronger than death, and that some paths cannot be walked back, only forward. The tides are commanded to show her path 6 times yearly, that the village may not forget what devotion requires." Margaret read this translation over and over on the train, the countryside sliding past outside her window, the afternoon light turning the fields gold. Made to remember. Not just observing a natural phenomenon, but actively creating the conditions for memory. The tides engineered to reveal the beach at specific times. The underwater structures, perhaps built by Abbot Sinewulf and his brothers, designed to create the pattern that would preserve Eadgyth's footprints. A deliberate act of memorial, created nearly 1,000 years ago. But why? What was so significant about Sister Eadgyth's walk into the sea that an abbot would undertake such a massive project to preserve its memory? And what does reach the place she sought mean? Did she die? Did she transcend? Did she literally travel somewhere through or under or beyond the sea? Margaret has searched for references to Sister Eadgyth in every available database, every medieval monastic record she can access. There were several women by that name in 10th century England. It was a common name, particularly among nobility and religious women. But none of the records she's found mention anything about walking into the sea, about Barrow's Hem, about a journey that required such elaborate memorialization, which means either the records are lost or Eadgyth's story was deliberately kept out of official histories. Both are possible. The 10th century was a tumultuous time. Viking invasions, political upheaval, the gradual Christianization of the north. Monasteries were destroyed, records burned or scattered, and some stories, particularly stories of women doing unconventional things, were simply not written down, or were written down and later suppressed because they didn't fit the approved narratives of what religious women were supposed to do and be. But Abbot Cinewulf remembered her, made sure the land itself would remember her, created a mechanism, a horologium, a clock, that would continue to mark her journey long after everyone who knew her personally was dead. That's not a small thing. That's not a casual memorial. That's profound commitment to preserving something that someone in power thought mattered deeply. Margaret has incorporated this information into her understanding of the mystery, but it raises as many questions as it answers. She knows now that the footprints are deliberately preserved, that there's intentionality behind the tidal pattern. She knows that there was a real woman named Eadgyth who walked into the sea in the 10th century. She knows that this was considered significant enough to warrant an engineering project that has lasted a millennium. But she still doesn't know why. What was Eadgyth doing? Where was she going? What did Abbot Cinewulf mean by determination is stronger than death? And why in the 13th century was this considered both an act of mercy and a warning? Chapter 7. The Deep Ebb Archive. Margaret maintains several systems for tracking the footprints, because she's learned over the years that different types of data reveal different patterns. There's the handwritten journal, traditional, immediate, visceral. Writing by hand forces a different kind of attention than typing. You can't skim, you can't copy-paste. Each entry is its own small act of presence. There's the digital database, practical, searchable, backupable. She can query it for patterns, how many appearances per year, average stride length, seasonal variations in sand texture, correlation with weather patterns. There's the photographic archive, visual record, showing details that written description might miss, the way light hits the prints differently, at different times of day, the occasional irregularities, a slightly deeper print here, a shuffled step there. And then there's what she calls the Deep Ebb Archive, a collection of everything she can gather from other sources about the specific days when the footprints appear. Because she realised, about 15 years into her watching, that the deep ebb days might be significant in ways beyond just revealing the footprints. If Abbot Cinewulf engineered the tides to create these regular, revealing moments, perhaps he intended them to be markers, calendrical points, days when attention should be paid not just to the beach but to the larger rhythms of land and sea and sky. So Margaret started collecting data about what else happens on deep ebb days. Weather patterns. Is there a correlation with storms, with clarity, with specific wind directions? Astronomical events. Do the days align with anything celestial, even if not with the obvious lunar or solar cycles? Historical events. Have significant things happened in the village or the region on these days? Biological patterns. Do local animals behave differently? Do migration patterns shift? The collection is eclectic, idiosyncratic, probably not scientifically rigorous by modern standards, but patterns have emerged. For one thing, deep ebb days almost always have unusual clarity. The air seems cleaner, sharper, as though the atmosphere itself has been scrubbed. Margaret has noticed this subjectively for years, but she started measuring it more objectively about 5 years ago, using a simple air quality monitor. And yes, the particulate count is consistently lower on deep ebb days, not by huge amounts, but noticeably. For another, there's a correlation with northern lights. Not perfect, not absolute, but more aurora borealis activity in the night surrounding deep ebb days than would be expected by chance. Margaret started tracking this after a conversation with an amateur astronomer in the next village over, who mentioned that he'd seen particularly vivid aurora several times while camping near Barrow's Hem, and when Margaret checked the dates, 4 out of 5 were within 2 days of a deep ebb. And then there are the dreams. This is the data that Margaret is most hesitant about, the part of the archive that she hasn't shared with anyone, that makes her question her own objectivity. But she can't ignore it. People in Barrow's Hem report unusual dreams on deep ebb nights. Not everyone, not consistently, but enough that when Margaret started quietly asking around, casually over tea, in the post office queue, a pattern emerged. Dreams of water, dreams of walking, dreams of a woman in white who's trying to say something, but no sound comes out. Dreams of underground chambers filled with tides. Dreams of bells ringing beneath the sea. Margaret has collected over 100 of these accounts now, written down in a separate notebook, dated and attributed. Most people who share them laugh a bit awkwardly, saying things like, just silly dream stuff or probably something I ate. But they remember the dreams vividly, which is itself notable. Most dreams fade quickly. These don't. She's had them herself. Not often, maybe 5 or 6 times in 36 years, but memorably. In the most vivid one, she was standing on Lomere Strand at night, but the sand was glowing faintly, bioluminescent, and she could see beneath the surface as though it were transparent. Beneath the sand were layers, centuries of layers, and in each layer were footprints, hundreds of them, thousands, all following the same path from cliff to water, all overlapping and accumulating like a palimpsest of journeys. And somehow in the dream, she understood that they weren't all the same person's footprints. They were different people, different travellers, different seekers, all following the path that Eadgyth had established, all walking toward whatever destination she'd reached. She woke from that dream with tears on her face, and a certainty she couldn't shake. The footprints that appear are just a visible trace of something much larger. A path that still exists, a journey that's still possible for those who know how to walk it, but possible when and how, and more importantly, should anyone? Because there's a reason Abbot Cinewulf called this both mercy and warning. There's a reason the beach only reveals itself occasionally, irregularly, not as an open invitation, but as a reminder. A demonstration that the path exists, but not necessarily an encouragement to take it. Margaret stands now in her workroom, the spare bedroom that has become, over decades, what Eleanor's workroom was before her, and looks at the deep ebb archive spread across the table. Notebooks and folders, printouts of astronomical data, hand-drawn charts showing the relationship between tide times and lunar phases, photographs of the beach in different conditions, maps both ancient and modern, 3 decades of accumulated attention, 3 decades of watching one mystery deepen and complicate, and refuse to resolve. She thinks about Iris Cole, who saw the Walker and was changed by it, who left Barrow's Hem and tried to forget but carried that vision with her for the rest of her life. Margaret knows this because she found Iris's obituary once, in a York newspaper, from 1947. Iris lived to be 79, married a doctor, taught music to children, lived an apparently ordinary and satisfying life. But the obituary, written probably by a family member who knew her well, includes this line. She often spoke of a mystery she encountered in her youth on the northern coast and maintained until her final days that there are paths in this world that lead to places we cannot name but might someday understand. Paths that lead to places we cannot name. Margaret looks at the clock. Nearly 11 now. The night's settling in deep and quiet around the cottage. Tomorrow she'll write up today's observations properly, enter everything into the database, develop the photographs she took on her old film camera, because some things still need to be documented the old way. But tonight, she's simply sitting with the question that has lived alongside her for most of her adult life. What if the path is still open? What if someone could walk it? And if they could, should they? The Chapter 8, The Last Walker. There's one more account that Margaret keeps separate from the others, locked in a drawer in her desk, because it's not historical, it's not from the archives, it's from 11 years ago, and it's not yet resolved. A man named Peter Graves came to Barrow's Hem in late October 2014. He was in his early 60s, retired professor of religious studies from Edinburgh, widowed recently, at loose ends in the way that people sometimes are after a major life change, when the structure that held them suddenly dissolves. He'd come across a reference to the Lomere footprints in an obscure journal article about medieval pilgrimage sites, and something about it caught his attention. He wrote to the church, asking if he could visit, if there were records he might consult. Reverend Pettigrew forwarded the letter to Margaret, and she wrote back, inviting him to visit, warning him that the mystery was more complicated and less explicable than any article might suggest. He came in November, stayed at the village's only bed and breakfast, spent a week going through the church archives, reading the journals Margaret was willing to share, walking the beach at various tides, taking photographs and measurements of his own. He was quiet, methodical, clearly accustomed to research. They had several long conversations in Margaret's cottage, drinking tea while the wind rattled the windows, talking about the history, the patterns, the theories that might or might not explain what was happening. On his last evening, he asked if he could see the beach during the next deep ebb. Margaret checked her calculations. There was one due in 3 days. She offered to wake him before dawn, to guide him down the cliff path in the dark, to show him how to observe without disturbing. He thanked her, said he'd like to go alone, if that was all right, that he wanted to sit with it quietly, without even her presence, which he clarified wasn't personal, just that he'd always done his best thinking in solitude. She understood, gave him a torch, warned him about the treacherous spots on the path, told him the tide would start returning around 7, that he should be off the beach by then. He went down that morning. Margaret watched from her window as his torch beam descended the cliff path in the pre-dawn darkness, a small moving point of light disappearing into the larger dark. She waited, made coffee, watched the sky lighten, watched the colours shift from black to grey to that pale luminous blue that precedes the sun. Around 7:30, she walked down to the beach herself. The tide was just beginning its return, shallow water creeping across the sand. She could see the footprints, a perfect set, 49 this time, leading from path to water. But she could also see Peter Graves's boot prints, distinct and different, leading down to where the ancient prints began. And there, at the point where the two sets of prints met, his tracks simply stopped. No signs of struggle, no evidence of disturbance. His boots were there, placed neatly side by side at the edge where the ancient footprints began, as though he'd removed them carefully and set them down. His socks were folded inside the boots, and from that point there was a third set of prints, bare feet, human-sized, following the same path as the ancient ones, matching them almost exactly in stride and depth, walking straight down to the water and vanishing where the shallow waves began. Margaret called for him, walked the beach systematically, checking the tide pools, the rock formations, anywhere someone might have taken shelter or fallen. She called the Coast Guard. They sent a boat. They searched. They found nothing. The police came. Interviewed Margaret extensively. She told them everything. The footprints, the history, Peter's interest in the mystery. She showed them his letter, his notes, his camera left in his room at the bed and breakfast. The photographs on that camera were the last record of Peter Graves's thoughts. The final image was time-stamped at 05:47, taken from the beach looking toward the water, the early light, the pristine sand, the ancient footprints visible in the frame, clear and purposeful. And in the bottom corner of the image, just barely visible, what might be a figure standing at the water's edge. Too distant, too blurred by the low light to make out clearly. It could be a person, could be a trick of shadow and reflection, could be many things. The police ruled it a probable drowning, though they noted the oddness of someone removing their boots so carefully if they were in distress. They speculated about suicide, about some kind of breakdown or spiritual crisis. The Scottish papers ran small stories about a missing professor. His adult children came down to collect his belongings, sad and bewildered. But Margaret knows it wasn't suicide. She read his notes. She talked with him at length. He wasn't despairing. He was curious, engaged, thoughtful. He'd written something in his notebook on the last page in the days before he went down to the beach. Margaret found it when the police asked her to go through his belongings, to see if there was anything that might explain his disappearance. The entry read, "If the path still exists, and everything I've seen suggests it does, then it's not meant to be analysed from the outside. It's meant to be walked. The invitation is there. The question is whether I have the courage or the foolishness, or perhaps the necessary desperation to accept it. What would it mean to walk into mystery without demanding to understand it first? What would it mean to trust that the destination exists, even if I can't see it or name it?" And below that, underlined twice, Eadgyth knew. Margaret has Peter's notebook in her locked drawer, along with copies of the police report and the photographs from his camera. She's the only one who knows that 3 days after he disappeared, she found a message written in the sand near the tide line. Not footprints this time, but letters traced carefully with a stick or finger. "Thank you." The tide erased it within an hour. She has a photograph, but it's not clear enough to prove anything to anyone who didn't want to believe it. It could be pareidolia, pattern-seeking in random marks. It could be something she imagined in her grief and confusion. Or it could be exactly what it appeared to be, a message from someone who'd walked the path and wanted those left behind to know that he'd arrived, wherever arrival meant. The question that haunts Margaret, the one that wakes her sometimes, at 3 a.m. with her heart pounding, is whether she failed Peter somehow. Whether she should have warned him more strongly. Whether she should have refused to tell him when the next deep ebb would occur. Whether her careful neutrality, her refusal to interpret or judge or advise, was actually a kind of enabling, or whether he was an adult making an informed choice, following a path that he believed led somewhere worth going, exercising the profound human right to seek mystery on his own terms. She doesn't know. She'll probably never know. But she thinks about him every time the footprints appear, wonders if his journey added to them somehow, if he's part of the pattern now, if somewhere in the layers of repeated prints is his own stride, his own purposeful walk toward whatever Eadgyth found 1,000 years ago. Chapter 9. The Question of Destination. So let's sit with this question together, you and I, here in the quiet of this late hour. Let's consider what all of this might mean. We have footprints that appear regularly, engineered to appear by a 10th century abbot who wanted to preserve the memory of a woman's journey. We have historical accounts stretching back centuries, consistent in their observations, even as they differ in interpretation. We have at least one documented instance of someone seeing the walker herself, not just her prints. And we have a recent disappearance that may or may not be connected, a man who walked into mystery and hasn't returned. The usual explanations don't quite fit. This isn't legend that's accumulated around a natural phenomenon. The footprints are real, measurable, photographable. This isn't mass hallucination. Too many observers over too much time, many of them skeptical or indifferent. This isn't fraud. What would be the motive? Barrow's Hem doesn't attract tourists. There's no financial incentive. No one profits from these appearances. So what are we left with? The medieval text called it a memorial, a way of remembering Sister Eadgyth's journey, but it also called it a warning and an act of mercy, which suggests the journey itself was significant in a way that transcends simple remembrance. You don't create an elaborate tidal mechanism just to memorialize someone who drowned tragically. You do it for someone who achieved something, who discovered something, who went somewhere that matters. Margaret has her theories. She's had 11 years since Peter's disappearance to think about them, to refine them, to test them against the evidence. Theory 1. The footprints are a kind of memorial path similar to the ritual walking of labyrinths or the Stations of the Cross. They mark a journey that was spiritually significant, and their regular appearance is meant to invite contemplation, to encourage others to think about what it means to walk with purpose toward an unknown destination. In this interpretation, Peter's disappearance might have been a tragic accident. He tried to walk into the sea in some kind of meditative state and drowned, his body carried away by the current. This is the safest theory, the one that requires the least suspension of disbelief. But it doesn't account for the boots placed so carefully. It doesn't explain the message in the sand, and it doesn't address why Abbot Sinewulf would go to such extraordinary lengths for what amounts to a metaphor. Theory 2. The footprints mark a path between worlds, between layers of reality, between the visible and the invisible. Eadgyth discovered, or was shown, or was called to, a way of travelling that doesn't involve physical distance in the normal sense. She walked into the sea and emerged somewhere else, somewhere that exists alongside or beneath or within our ordinary world. The footprints reappear as a reminder that this path still exists, that the boundary between worlds is thinner here, that those with the right knowledge or intention or desperation can still make the crossing. Peter knew this somehow, or intuited it, and he chose to walk it. This is the mystical theory, the one that requires belief in things that can't be proven, in realities beyond the material. Margaret doesn't reject it out of hand. She's seen too much strangeness to be certain that materialism explains everything, but she's cautious about embracing it completely. It's too easy to tumble into fantasy, to abandon careful observation in favour of wish fulfillment. Theory 3. The path is literal, but the destination is death. And what Abbot Sinewulf created was a kind and merciful way for people to choose their own ending. Eadgyth walked into the sea deliberately, perhaps because she was ill, perhaps because she was fleeing something worse, perhaps because she had simply completed what she'd come to this life to do. The abbot honoured her choice by creating a mechanism that would allow others to make the same choice, but only occasionally, only when the tides aligned, so that it wouldn't be easy or impulsive, but would require patience and intention. The message in the sand that Margaret found wasn't from Peter, alive somewhere else. It was a kind of psychic imprint, a final expression of gratitude from someone at peace with his decision. This is the darkest theory, the one Margaret resists most strongly, because it makes her complicit in Peter's death if true. She gave him the information he needed to walk the path. She enabled his choice. And if the path is simply a ritualized form of suicide, then she's failed in some fundamental duty of care. And then there's theory 4, which she only allows herself to consider late at night when rationality has softened into something more permeable. All 3 previous theories are partially true, or none of them are, or the truth is something so foreign to ordinary human categories that any attempt to name it will be inadequate. The path is real, the destination exists, but it's not something that can be explained in the terms we usually use for explanation. Eadgyth walked somewhere that is both death and transcendence, both ending and continuation, both here and elsewhere. Peter followed her because something in him recognized the invitation, because he'd reached a point in his life where the ordinary paths had lost their meaning, and he needed something else, something more, something true in a way that daily life had stopped being true. In this theory, Margaret's role isn't to prevent or enable, but simply to bear witness, to maintain the records, to be the one who watches and remembers, who holds the question open for those who come after, who doesn't foreclose possibilities by insisting on a single interpretation. This is the theory she's learned to live with, not because she's certain it's correct, but because it allows her to continue the work without being paralyzed by guilt or doubt or the need for answers that may not exist in any form she'd recognize. The footprints appear. She documents them. The mystery continues. She watches it continue. And somewhere in that patient attention, there's a kind of meaning that doesn't require resolution to be valid. Chapter 10. The Archive of Watchers. Let's talk about why this matters. Why Margaret has devoted her life to this. Why anyone should care about mysterious footprints on a remote beach that most people will never see. Because it would be easy to dismiss this as obsession, as wasted effort, as misallocated attention in a world that has so many urgent problems requiring practical solutions. And Margaret has heard that critique, gently expressed by well-meaning friends who wonder why she doesn't move to a city, why she doesn't apply her considerable skills to something more obviously useful, why she spends her days watching for something that might ultimately mean nothing. But here's what she understands, what she's learned through decades of patient watching. The world is full of mysteries. Most of them are ignored or dismissed because they don't fit into our existing categories of understanding. They're inconvenient to acknowledge. They disrupt the comfortable narrative that we've figured everything out, that science has explained the important parts and the rest is just superstition or delusion. The footprints at Lomere Strand are inconvenient. They don't fit neatly into any disciplinary framework. They're not quite archaeology, not quite natural science, not quite folklore, not quite theology. They exist in the gaps between what we think we understand, and they refuse to be resolved by any single methodology. And so most people ignore them, or explain them away with theories that don't quite account for the evidence, but are comfortable enough to allow dismissal. But Margaret, and others like her, the lineage of watchers stretching back through Eleanor and Thomas Weatherby, and all the names in the church archives, Margaret understands that this refusal to be easily explained is exactly what makes the mystery valuable. Because what we're really talking about here is the possibility that reality is larger, stranger, more layered than our ordinary perceptions allow. That there are paths we haven't mapped, destinations we haven't named, ways of being in the world that our current frameworks can't accommodate. And if that's true, if there are paths like the one Eadgyth walked, then paying attention matters. Documenting matters. Keeping the records matters. Because someday, someone might need to know that the path exists. Someone like Peter Graves, who'd reached a point where ordinary life wasn't enough anymore, who needed to know that there were still mysteries that hadn't been flattened into explanations, still journeys that required faith rather than certainty. Margaret has built an archive of watchers, not just her own journals and her mother's and grandfather's, but correspondence with other people who've noticed inexplicable things in their own corners of the world. She has a network, informal and small, of people who pay attention to the edges, to the phenomena that don't fit, to the persistent strangeness that underlies what we pretend is a fully known world. There's a woman in Cornwall who documents lights that appear over a particular hill on nights with no moon, lights that move with apparent intelligence, but match no known aircraft or natural phenomenon. There's a man in the Hebrides who maintains records of a standing stone that casts shadows inconsistent with the sun's position, shadows that sometimes point toward places hundreds of miles away at the exact moment when something significant is happening in those places. There's a retired librarian in Yorkshire who catalogues accounts of people encountering their own doppelgangers in a specific intersection in Leeds, always at twilight, always with a sense of profound unease that lingers for days. These aren't famous mysteries. They don't have television shows made about them. They're not profitable or sensational. They're just persistent oddities that some people have noticed and decided to track, to document, to hold space for. And collectively, these watchers are doing something important. They're maintaining a record of the world's refusal to be completely known. They're testifying to the fact that mystery still exists, that there are still territories of human experience that haven't been colonized by explanation. This is countercultural work in an age that claims to have answers for everything. In an age where any question can supposedly be Googled, where expertise is presumed to be universal and accessible, where mystery is treated as a temporary condition awaiting resolution, the Watchers are saying, no. Some things persist, some things resist, some things remain beautifully, frustratingly, essentially unknown. And that unknowing is precious. It's the space where wonder lives. It's the territory where human beings encounter the limits of their understanding and have to decide whether to turn back or lean forward into the uncertainty. Margaret thinks about this sometimes when she's cataloguing another appearance of the footprints, when the work feels repetitive and pointless. She reminds herself that she's not trying to solve the mystery. Not really. She's trying to preserve it, to keep it alive for the next person who needs to know that there are still mysteries worth attending to, still paths that lead somewhere, even if we can't name where. Because maybe Eadgyth's path isn't meant for everyone. Maybe it's only meant for people like Peter Graves, people who've reached a particular point in their understanding or their desperation or their readiness. Maybe the fact that it only reveals itself occasionally, irregularly, is intentional, a way of ensuring that only those who are truly paying attention, truly patient, truly committed will find it. And if that's true, then Margaret's work is crucial. She's the keeper, not just of records, but of possibility itself. She's the one who makes sure that when someone needs to find the path, the information will be there. The coordinates, the patterns, the history, the warning and the invitation both. This is why she continues, not because she expects to solve anything, but because some mysteries are worth preserving, and because someone has to be the one who watches, who remembers, who maintains the archive for whoever comes next. Chapter 11. The Turning of the Tide. We're coming to the end now, you and I. The end of this telling, though not the end of the mystery itself. The mystery continues. The footprints will appear again, somewhere in the weeks or months ahead, and Margaret will be there to document them, to add another entry to journals that span generations. But before we drift towards sleep, before we let the story soften into dreams, there's one more thing to share. Margaret is 73 now, the same age her mother was when she died, which has given her a new sense of urgency about continuity, about succession, about who will watch when she can no longer walk the cliff path down to Lowmere Strand. She has no children, no obvious heir to pass the journals to. She spent some time worrying about this, about what happens to decades of careful observation when the observer is gone. But recently, just last month actually, something unexpected happened. A young woman came to Barrow's Hem. Her name is Sarah, she's 28, and she's a graduate student in environmental science studying the effects of climate change on coastal erosion patterns. She'd come to this stretch of coast to take measurements, to collect data, completely unaware of the footprints or the history or any of it. But she stayed at the same bed and breakfast where Peter Graves had stayed, and the owner, an elderly woman named Jean who's lived in the village her entire life, mentioned in passing that if Sarah was interested in unusual coastal phenomena, she should talk to Margaret Hollis. So Sarah knocked on Margaret's door one grey afternoon in October, apologetic about interrupting, explaining that she'd heard Margaret knew something about the beach, about unusual tidal patterns, and would she mind answering a few questions for Sarah's research? Margaret invited her in, made tea, and found herself talking, carefully at first, then more freely, about the tides and the underwater structures and the way Lowmere Strand reveals itself irregularly, unpredictably, according to patterns that David Chen had documented, but not fully explained. Sarah was fascinated, asked smart questions, wanted to see Chen's thesis, talked about bringing proper monitoring equipment, about running computer models of the tidal flows, about how modern technology might be able to map the underwater structures more completely than the brief dive Margaret had done decades ago. Margaret showed her some of the records. Not everything, not yet, but enough. The photographs of footprints, the measurements, some of the historical documents. Sarah's response was interesting. She didn't immediately try to explain them away, didn't jump to fraud or delusion or natural phenomena. She just looked, studied the photographs, read the descriptions, and finally said, "That's extraordinary. I don't know what would cause that, but it's definitely worth documenting carefully." They've been meeting regularly since then. Sarah comes by twice a week, and they talk about tides and sand patterns and erosion rates, but they also talk about the footprints, about the history, about what it means to watch something carefully over time without forcing it to make sense. Last week, Sarah asked if she could see the church archives, and yesterday she asked when the next deep ebb is likely to occur, Margaret told her. Mid-December probably, based on her calculations. Maybe the 17th or 18th, Sarah nodded, said she'd like to be there, said she'd like to see the footprints if they appear, said she's been thinking about her dissertation, about whether there might be room in it for documenting phenomena that don't fit easily into the usual categories of environmental science. Margaret hasn't told her about Peter Graves yet, hasn't shown her the locked drawer, the notebook, the final photographs. That's not a conversation for early in a relationship, not when trust is still being built, but she will, eventually. Because if Sarah is going to be the next watcher, and Margaret thinks she might be, thinks she's seeing in Sarah's careful attention and patient curiosity the same qualities that have sustained this work for generations, then Sarah needs to know everything, the wonder and the warning both. The path exists, some people walk it, some don't return, at least not in any way that the ordinary world recognizes, and the watcher's job isn't to prevent or encourage, but simply to bear witness, to maintain the records, to hold the question open. Sarah doesn't know yet whether she wants that role. She's young, her career is just beginning. She has options and ambitions that might take her far from this remote stretch of coast. But something brought her here. Something made John mention Margaret's name. Something in Sarah responded to the mystery rather than dismissing it. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how the lineage continues, not through family bloodlines or formal appointments, but through recognition. One person who pays attention recognizing another, passing on the work to someone who has the patience and the curiosity and the humility to continue it. Margaret is thinking about this now, standing at her window as evening deepens into night. The cottage is warm around her, the lamp on her desk casting gentle yellow light across the latest journal, the one with today's entry still fresh on the page. Down below, invisible in the darkness, the tide is turning. Water creeping back across Lowmere Strand, covering the sand where this morning's footprints appeared. By morning, they'll be erased, the beach smooth again, waiting for the next revealing. The pattern continues. The clock keeps time in its own way, marking intervals that human calendars don't quite capture. The mystery persists, patient and strange and beautiful. And somewhere, in the archives, in the photographs, in the journals spanning generations, the invitation remains. The path exists. The destination, whatever it is, waits for those who are ready, for those who are called, for those who have the courage or the desperation or the profound, inexplicable certainty that there's somewhere else to go, somewhere beyond the ordinary paths, somewhere that Eadgyth reached 1,000 years ago, and Peter Graves reached 11 years ago, and others might reach tomorrow or next year, or a century from now. The beach remembers, the tides reveal, the watchers document, and the mystery, blessedly, remains a mystery. Chapter 12. The Dream of Deep Water. Let yourself sink now. Let the story settle around you like blankets, like fog, like the slow, inevitable rise of the tide. We've walked together tonight along Lowmere Strand, following footprints that lead somewhere we can't quite see. We've descended into church crypts where old records wait patiently in the darkness. We've stood with Margaret at her window, watching the light change over the water, watching the patterns emerge and dissolve, and emerge again. You're tired now. Your eyes are heavy. The room around you is quiet, or nearly quiet. Just the soft sounds of night, distant traffic maybe, the house settling, your own breath deepening as the day releases you. Think about water for a moment. Not frightening water, not dangerous water, just water. The way it moves, the way it remembers the moon's pull, responds to it, rises and falls in patterns that have continued since before there were eyes to watch them. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. Always, reliable as breath, older than memory. And somewhere, on a beach you might never visit, footprints appear in the sand. Evidence of a journey, trace of a path. Reminder that some mysteries are worth preserving, simply because they're mysterious, because they remind us that the world is larger than our understanding of it. You don't need to solve anything tonight. You don't need to decide what the footprints mean or where the path leads or whether you'd walk it if you found it. You just need to rest, to let the story become part of your dreaming, to carry with you, as you drift, the knowledge that there are still watchers in the world, still people paying careful attention to the edges, still mysteries waiting patiently for those who are ready to witness them. Margaret will be there tomorrow morning, if the tide allows, walking down the cliff path in the pre-dawn darkness, her boots crunching on loose stones, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She'll document whatever appears or doesn't appear. She'll add another entry to the journal. She'll continue the work that her mother did, that her grandfather did. That stretches back through names half forgotten to Abbot Sinewolf himself, who looked at a beach and decided it should remember. And maybe someday you'll think about this story. Maybe you'll wonder about the footprints. Maybe you'll imagine standing on a silver strand at dawn, watching the light shift, watching the water reveal what it's kept hidden all night. Maybe you'll understand why someone would devote their life to watching, to documenting, to preserving a mystery that refuses to be solved. Or maybe you'll just remember that there are still paths in the world that lead somewhere strange, still journeys that require faith instead of certainty, still beaches that remember what happened on them centuries ago and show their memories to those patient enough to watch. Let that thought comfort you. Let it soften the edges of worry. Let it carry you down into sleep like a tide going out, gentle and inevitable and ancient. The footprints appear, the watchers document, the mystery continues, and you can rest now. The work is being done, the records are being kept. The path exists whether you walk it or not. Close your eyes, feel the weight of your body against the mattress, the pillow soft beneath your head. Listen to your own breathing, steady and slow, like waves on a shore, like the patient rhythm of the sea. Somewhere, water is rising. Somewhere, sand is being covered. Somewhere, a beach is holding its secrets until the next revealing. And you are safe. You are warm. You are exactly where you need to be. The story continues without you needing to hold it. The mystery persists without you needing to solve it. The tide turns without you needing to watch it. All of that continues. All of that goes on. And you can let go now. Drift, dream, rest. The footprints will still be there in the morning, or they won't. The beach will remember, or it will wait. The path will lead wherever it leads. And in the end, the truth remains open to interpretation.